fish swimming upstream, dead deer on the side of the road, geese flying in their V-shaped formations. These are likely familiar sights to all of us, but we may not have stopped to think about their significance. All wildlife species migrate each year, sometimes hundreds of miles, in order to survive. Utah DWR biologists and other partners have a unique way of helping them make that trip. This is Wild, a Utah Division of Wildlife Resources podcast. I'm your host, Faith Heaton-Jolly, and this is episode 12, Traveling Wildlife. Welcome back to the Wild Podcast. Today is our 12th episode. We're here in studio. As you can tell probably from our previous episodes, we are again wearing masks. So that's why we're kind of breathing hard and sound a little muffled. So just bear with us. I'm excited about the topic today. I have Daniel Olson here in studio with me. He is our DWR Utah Migration Initiative Coordinator. We're going to talk about wildlife migration today and our program and kind of how it all works. So thanks for coming on, Daniel.
Yeah, no problem, Faith. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, he's great. I've done some work with Daniel in the past. How long have you been at the division?
So I've worked for the Division of Wildlife for about 3 years now.
Okay, about 3 years. And have you been in the same role the entire time that you've been here?
So I actually worked in Oregon before I took this job in Utah. But I did a bunch of my graduate research work in Utah prior to that.
Oh, that's awesome. Were you doing similar stuff in Oregon with wildlife migration type programs?
So it was actually different. I worked for the Department of Forestry, so we were monitoring like large scale timber projects.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Moved from plants to animals.
Right.
Just a man of many trades over here.
Right.
No, that's awesome. So kind of start us off. What is our Wildlife Migration Initiative and when was it started here in Utah?
Yeah, so our Wildlife Migration Initiative started in 2017, and so it was kind of born out of a couple things. One of them was that the technology to track wildlife movement has greatly evolved in the last 10 to 20 years. And so now we can specifically track animals, which really helps us understand better what they do. The other thing is the state of Utah is growing incredibly fast right now. Over the last decade, Utah was the fastest growing state in the country.
Oh, yeah.
And so with all that growth comes a lot of change that can affect how wildlife move and use the landscape. So just over like the last about 20 to 25 years, the traffic volumes have doubled in the state. So it's a lot harder for animals to move long distances when they have to cross roads to deal with all that traffic that we have now.
Sure. I was about to say our longtime residents that are listening are probably like, yes, I can attest to this. Traffic is terrible. So kind of just to study how animals are migrating and help them on the migration as Utah populations increase throughout the years.
Right. So we kind of have like three big objectives that we're trying to do with the Migration Initiative. One is to document wildlife movement, because even for species that we've studied for years, we don't often know their movements very well. So for instance, deer and elk, we've done tons of studies on them over the years, but we don't always know where their migration corridors are at and how they use them. And so that's a great opportunity right now to find those things out. And for other species, they just move really long distances, which can make them hard to track. So some of our bird species will leave the state, some of them leave the country. And so the tracking technologies that we have available to us now lets us see those movements in really high resolution.
And so were we tracking animals or tracking their migration patterns before this program was kind of officially launched?
Yeah, so we've been tracking animals for a long time. The previous way that we used to do it was put a radio collar on an animal. So the collar would emit a radio signal, and we'd have to go in the field with an antenna or fly over the animal with an antenna to locate it, which was really labor intensive, and it made it. And for some animals that moved long distances, we just wouldn't be able to find them. We wouldn't know where they went.
Because you had to be fairly close, right, to get the signal.
Pretty much line of sight.
Okay.
So yeah, from the ground that can be pretty difficult, especially for some of our species that live in mountainous terrain.
You mentioned we previously have done the radio collaring, and I did a previous episode for those that are following the podcast. We talked about our deer helicopter captures and some of that work. So yeah, talk a little bit about how we track them now, kind of the technology that we're using?
Right. So we still have to capture the animals. So that's always a big feat. And one of the ways we do that is with helicopters and net guns, where we actually fly over the animal and shoot a net over the top of them,
Right.
which is really cool, exciting work. But then once we have the animal captured, we for most species now we put a GPS tracking device on them. And so for our bigger animals like deer and elk, they wear it as a collar. For some of our bird species, they'll wear it as a little backpack on their back.
Which those are cool to see, yeah.
They are.
It really does look like a little backpack. They're like turkeys are heading off to school or something.
Right. But the data we get back from it's incredible. For deer, for example, the tracking collars are giving us a location every 2 hours where that animal's at. And we basically get that data in real time now, so we can open up our computers in the office and see where all the animals at we're tracking right now. So really powerful technology that we didn't have available to us until recently.
That's pretty wild. And when did we switch from kind of that radio technology to the GPS?
We first started using GPS collars around 2004, probably.
Okay.
But it was very expensive to buy collars back then. And so we would just put them on a few individuals, and we had really limited data from that. And so now over the years, the technology has evolved and it's gotten cheaper. And now we almost solely use GPS tracking. So for instance, when I came to work at DWR in 2017, we had about 1 million animal tracking locations in our database. And now we have almost 20 million just 3 years later.
Oh, wow.
So the scale at which we're doing this has increased a lot.
Oh, that's wild.
We're tracking thousands of animals throughout the state right now. So really incredible and really helpful for management.
That's crazy. And you kind of mentioned some of them. What are some of the types of species that we're tracking right now?
So so we do there's a large focus on big game species such as deer, elk, and pronghorn right now. So a lot of the tracking we're doing is on them, but we also track all kinds of other species too. So we have tracking collars on cougars, on bobcats. We track fish, not necessarily GPS, but we have good ways to track fish as well. And a lot of work on birds right now. So we have some cool studies on pelicans. They spend part of their year at the Great Salt Lake, and then they migrate to other places. A lot of them go down to Mexico for the winter.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's been really cool to see their migration paths. They don't always follow the same route. Some of them will go down through Nevada and California to Mexico. Some of them go all the way out through the Midwest and then come back down into Mexico. So really, really cool and interesting movements.
That's awesome. Yeah. And so kind of talk about why is it important for wildlife to be able to migrate?
Yeah, so it's really important for a lot of our populations and species to be able to migrate. For one, it gives them access to resources they wouldn't normally be able to get to. And so a lot of times what's happening is that they're in the winter, they're on areas that are less productive, but they give them shelter from the winter conditions. There's less snow, and they can kind of survive in those areas. But in the summer, our high elevation habitats open up and they're snow-free, and there's a lot of food up there, so they'll move up to the high country and be able to use all those resources in those areas. And then when it snows again in the fall or early winter, then they move back down to their winter ranges. So
to their shelter areas. Okay.
Yeah.
So go and get fat in the summer for the winter and just move back and forth. Okay.
Yeah, for a lot of our species, that's the goal, to get as fat as possible during the summer, and so you can survive the winter.
Totally. And have you seen in doing this, are most of the species, are they basically going to and from those same areas each year? Is it kind of a similar pattern?
Yeah, so it's species dependent, but for species like deer, we see that they learn their migration patterns from their mom. So they learn where their summer range is and where their winter range is from their mother, who teaches it to them. And then they follow those same routes, almost like they walk the same trails every year.
It's like clockwork, yeah.
Yep, to go get between them.
Interesting. And they're migrating about the same time each year too, I would guess.
Yeah, so there's some variability year to year on when they migrate. Some of our animals that have short migrations, they can kind of hold out and wait longer, stay in the high country as long as possible until they're forced out. Some of the species that have to make longer migrations, they migrate like clockwork during the fall or spring.
I see.
Yeah.
And I about to say, we get this question a lot from people, and I'm assuming that's kind of why you'll see more deer down by the road when it starts getting cold or there's snow, and we'll have an increase in vehicle accidents maybe a certain time of year. And then same with cougars. We see a lot of cougars in the cities during the winters, I guess, following the deer coming down. And so they are kind of dependent on those weather patterns and just being able to find food and shelter.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation, Faith. So a lot of our summer range for deer and elk and other species are high elevations away from busy roads.
Sure.
And then in the winter, when they have to come down to their winter ranges, those winter ranges are often adjacent to some of our busiest roads, which can increase the likelihood of hitting the animals.
Right. And what would you say is kind of the main time of year that we see a lot of these vehicle wildlife collisions?
Yeah, so it depends on the part of the state that you're in and what highway you're on and whether it's adjacent to a summer or winter range. But typically we see spikes during the migration periods, which are generally in the spring. That would be like mid-March through middle of June.
Gotcha.
That period when animals are on the move trying to get between their ranges. And then that happens again in the fall, about end of September, October, they'll start moving, and that can go through November. Also, the breeding season for deer is in November, so you can often see deer moving more because of that too, and end up on the roads.
So good times of year to pay special attention to deer or elk or other big game crossing the roads.
Right.
So what are some of the biggest factors that prevent wildlife from being able to migrate to these different areas?
Yeah, so there's a lot of factors that can affect how wildlife move. Things such as roads that we talked about already, fencing, developments, even things like energy development can affect how animals migrate. So their studies have examined how mule deer are affected by like oil and gas development. And even though they still have lots of room to migrate through those areas, they speed up their migration, so their patterns change. They move faster through those areas where there's oil and gas development than they normally would without it.
So a lot of it is, I guess, kind of man-made type structures that are prohibiting them from getting to these areas. Okay.
Right. There can be natural barriers too. So if you have a really steep cliffs, they might have to navigate around those. For our fish species, like there can be natural waterfalls in the streams and rivers that prevent the fish from moving upstream. Largely, what we're seeing are man-made barriers that are affecting wildlife movement.
Okay. So what are some of the things that this program is doing and we as a division are doing to try and help these wildlife be able to continue that migration and overcome some of these barriers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the big hurdles we have is just knowing how animals move and use the landscape, which has been kind of a mystery up until recently. And GPS tracking's helped us figure that out. So now we know where these migration corridors are at, how they use them, what time of year they're using them. And that really helps us make good management decisions on how we keep those corridors open for animals to move through them. Sometimes the fixes are really easy too, Faith. For our aquatic species, it may just be modifying a culvert. So sometimes we put culverts in the streams. Those culverts might not match the water level, so the culvert might be above the water level, and the fish would have to jump from the water into the culvert to move upstream. And sometimes it's too far for them to jump. So small changes like just modifying culverts so fish don't have to jump up into them or try to jump into them can open up miles of stream above that culvert.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And that, I about to say, the fish ones probably are hard because it's all dependent. They have to have that water path and have it unobstructed. Okay.
Right. But the other cool thing too is that there's an incredible amount of interest in wildlife movement right now. And a lot of the folks, other agencies that we work with are really interested in it and trying to preserve it. And so we have about 30 partners right now that are part of the Migration Initiative. Agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, some of our other state agencies are involved. Groups like the Mule Deer Foundation, Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife are all coming together to work on these problems and find resources to solve them.
That's awesome. And I guess it would take a big partnership like that because sometimes they're migrating through different land areas that are managed by various people, and it takes funding, I would assume, to build these structures.
Yeah. That's such a great point that maybe I can just elaborate on that for a second.
Yeah.
So the migrations that animals make are often the longest movements that they make, and these long movements invariably take them across a variety of ownership. So they're moving from BLM land to state land to maybe Forest Service land and maybe some private land in between there. So if we're going to keep that type of movement intact, it requires all those people coming to the table to work on the problem. We can't just solve it as DWR or as BLM.
Sure. Yeah, totally. That makes sense. I mean, the animals don't care whose land it is. They
Right.
just know they need to get up to their, where the food is or where the shelter is. Right.
Right.
Interesting. And so, and talk about, I know we do probably the most visible one that people are aware of or have maybe seen is some of our wildlife crossings for big game species. So talk about those. What are the different types of wildlife crossings that we'll install to help prevent some of these vehicle wildlife collisions?
Right. So there's a variety of ways we can help animals get across the road. One of the ways that we can do it is just simply make crosswalks for them. So they just come across the road at grade, across the traffic lanes. And we typically only use those in areas with lower traffic volumes and have warning signs associated with it to let the drivers know that there might be animals on the road. But as roads get busier, those don't work as well. And so we might install specific structures to get the animal over the road or underneath it. And so a lot of times for deer, we'll build big culverts under the highway. They'll allow the animals just to pass right under the highway, and they adapt to that readily.
Which is super interesting. Yeah. It's like such a smart way to do it because it's not as intrusive, and they are kind of cool. They're just big little round circles. If people haven't seen a culvert, they
Right.
just go right under the road. It's like a little tunnel for them.
Right. And so for instance, in 2013, we did a lot of work on Highway 89, kind of east of Kanab and the very southern part of the state.
Oh yeah, that's my stomping grounds.
Yeah,
It's a good area.
So down that part of the state is our Paunsaugunt deer herd. That's a world famous deer herd, and they're also some of our longest migrators in the state. So some of those deer are moving like 70, 80 miles between their summer and winter ranges, but it takes them across Highway 89. And that used to be like one of the worst spots in the state for wildlife vehicle collisions. A lot of deer got killed in that area. And so to fix the problem, they installed fencing across that migration corridor, but they also included 6 crossings to get them underneath the highway. And they're some of the most used in the country.
Oh, wow.
So they've been doing research on those crossings since 2013. And they've documented like 75,000 animals going through those 6 crossings.
Oh, wow.
Over
That's
that
a
time.
lot.
A ton.
Oh, wow. That's amazing, actually.
Yeah.
Holy cow. I didn't even realize that, wow, it's such high use.
Yeah.
And probably one of the more visible ones that people have seen is not one of the culvert types, but it's that big kind of bridge that goes over I-80 by Parley's Canyon. I feel like that one's gotten a lot of publicity and people have seen that one. I guess the culverts are more common, right, than doing like a big overpass?
Yeah, they're more common. They're more cost effective.
Okay.
So they're still extremely expensive. And that's one of the limitations of trying to solve this problem is just having the resources to build the infrastructure.
Gotcha.
But the culvert-style crossings are hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Wow.
The bridge type that go over the highway are typically in the millions. So
Oh, wow.
the new one that was built in end of 2018 and beginning of 2019, that one cost about $5 million. The one that's near Park City
Holy
on
cow.
I-80.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And we partnered with UDOT on that one strongly, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, and that's one thing that is probably good to point out too, is I know we do get we'll get messages or emails or calls or whatever that people will say, I'm seeing a lot of dead deer or dead elk or whatever in this one area. Just why don't you put up some kind of crossing or something? But it's important to note, like, these are very expensive, and
Right.
so you have to have the funding, you have to have the resources to be able to install these. And talk about how are we identifying or choosing which areas to install some of these, structures like this?
Right. So oftentimes it may come with the Department of Transportation. They're going to do some expansion or update to a highway, so they're already doing work there. And we might get in the planning process and we know that there's a problem there with wildlife vehicle collisions, or we have a migration corridor. And so we'll get in the process there. We also try to prioritize what are the worst spots in the state and work on those. One of those areas is near Echo Reservoir, where I-84 and I-80 come together at that interchange. That's one of our deer winter ranges in that area. So we have thousands of deer that congregate right in that interchange area during the winter, and a lot of them get hit on the road trying to move through that interchange. And so
man.
we're working right now with the Department of Transportation to try to help make that problem a little better for drivers and for wildlife.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. No, I know it's like an ongoing thing, we're trying to identify some of these areas and help it out so there's less problems for sure. So as you've been kind of overseeing this program and seeing some of the data and the studies, what are some of the coolest, examples of kind of unique things that we've seen or learned since we've been tracking wildlife so closely?
Yeah, so it's incredible. We learn new things about how wildlife move every single day, things that we didn't know were happening. One cool example is a study that we're working on with Utah State, Dr. Julie Young's helping with that project. But we captured a cougar near Logan a couple winters ago. This was a 2-year-old animal that had an established territory. And then for whatever reason, it decided to move, and it headed north, and it went all the way to Jackson, Wyoming.
Oh, wow.
And then spent some time there, moved back into Idaho, headed south again, came down through Idaho Falls and Pocatello, back into Utah near Snowville, and then back into Idaho. So now it's kind of south of Burley, and that animal moved about 600 miles
Oh my gosh.
in just a few months. So those movements are incredible. That wildlife can still do that in our busy landscapes. Be able to make movements like that.
That's crazy. And is that pretty typical for a cougar, or is that kind of unheard of to see it move that far?
So we do know that cougars occasionally make long movements like that, but it's just really cool to see all the steps that animal took to make a movement like that.
It's like the grass is greener in Idaho, and nope, back to Utah. And that's so interesting. That's so far. Yeah. And yeah, what are some other things that we've seen?
So one that really stands out in my mind is a razorback sucker project that's been going for many years. And so these are an endangered fish that live in the Colorado River. And about 7 or 8 years ago, they released a hatchery fish with a tracking device and monitored its movements. And so for fish, it's different. They put a little tracking chip like inside of it, but they implant it in the body of the fish.
Sure.
And then when the fish swims under an antenna, then it logs where that fish is at. And so over this past 7-year period, they documented where it's been in the Green River and the Colorado River. And what they saw was that from where it was released in Green River, Utah, that it went south, moved down the Green River to the confluence of the Colorado River and Green River, and then it went all the way to Grand Junction, came back from Grand Junction, went all the way down to Lake Powell.
Oh, wow.
From Lake Powell, it went north all the way up the Green River, all the way to Vernal. So essentially, it moved almost 1,000 miles and kind of went to like the entire north-south extent of the state. Incredible.
That's wild.
And we had no idea that those fish were moving like that.
That's wild. And I guess since then, I mean, does it seem like that's fairly common for this species to move that much, or was this kind of an anomaly?
Oh, that's a really good question, Faith. I don't know if I can answer that one, but I think it surprised a lot of people that fish moved that far. Yeah.
That's a long ways. No, that's wild. Well, and we'd kind of talked before we started recording, but one of the cool ones that I'd seen recently, we did a video of this little boreal toad, and I guess, was it being tracked with one of those same kind of little inserted tracker type things?
Right. Yeah. So it's like a little chip, kind of similar to what you would put in your pet if you wanted to keep track of it.
Tracking thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you have to catch the toad to scan it to know which toad it is. But
okay.
Yeah.
Well, and this one was cool, and it was kind of unique because it only had 3 legs, right?
Right.
And so it was just like this little traveling, just still getting around pretty good, and they got some cool footage of him moving. But they tracked him going like 5 miles, right, over like crazy landscapes.
Right. Yeah. So these toads, they really surprise us on how far they can move. You wouldn't think that they'd be capable of doing it.
Oh yeah, especially with 3 legs.
Right. And so they live in wet areas, and that's where we catch them at. So they caught this toad in one pond. And then they were like 5 miles away at another pond catching toads again, and they figured out that individual had moved 5 miles, and between those 2 ponds was just desert landscape. So it's just moving through sagebrush, dry ground, on 3 legs to get
So
to this other
crazy.
pond. So incredible.
He's like the Rocky of toads,
Right.
just like you can hear the theme song as he's going over this mountain.
Yeah.
So wild. Well, and the other one that I think you had shared with us previously, and I can't remember exactly when it was, but they saw some deer they basically tracked and put together the pinpoints that they swam all the way across Flaming Gorge Reservoir.
Yeah, it's incredible. So that I can even add more detail to that. So even before we had tracking collars on those deer, one of our previous directors was fishing on Flaming Gorge, and while they were out fishing, they saw a group of like 3 or 4 deer swim by their boat. They're
So
like,
crazy.
"What are these deer doing out
Yeah.
here?" And so a couple years ago, we got tracking collars on animals in that area, and we were able to document that movement. So they were swimming across about a mile of open water
That's so
across the
wild.
gorge, and so that was to get between their summer and winter ranges.
So crazy. And I guess that's kind of stuff that we wouldn't have even guessed. Like,
Right.
maybe we would have thought they'd go all the way around or something, but
Right.
apparently deer are good swimmers. So
Very good.
that's something we've learned from all this.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, some of those stories are so wild and just so interesting, like you said, that we're able to like document this kind of data now with this tracking, and so we know for sure like these things are happening. These animals are capable of moving huge distances that maybe we didn't realize before, which is crazy.
Right.
So what are some of the successes that you feel like we've seen since we've implemented this program?
So one of the huge successes, I think, is just the scale that we're tracking wildlife at now. Like, our data collection is just incredible, and with good data, we get good understanding of what wildlife do, which then can be translated into good management. And so we're working right now to analyze all this tracking data we're collecting and make really good maps so we can share with our partners who are trying to plan how they manage the landscape based on that information.
And I guess, and I think we'd kind of touched on this in the previous episode I did about deer collaring, is once we know where they're spending their summer, we know, okay, that's where we should plant more feed for deer or for elk or whatever, so that they can be fat enough to survive the winter once they migrate down. And so it is a very direct correlation between the data we're getting and the projects we do.
Absolutely, yeah. So we can see where the summer ranges are, how intensely different areas within those ranges are used. We can see the migration corridors and these linkages between the summer and winter ranges. And then when they're on their winter range, we can see how they use their winter range. So yeah, it's the whole cycle of the year is documented well with these tracking collars.
Interesting. And have you, during kind of these partnerships too, and since we've started this program, has this impacted how some city developments take place? Like, if we realize, okay, deer are migrating through this specific area, that you want to build a mall or something, has that kind of affected some of these city building decisions?
Right, yeah. No, that's a great question, Faith. So that's actually happening right now. So a couple years ago, we were able to get tracking collars on deer on the Oquirrh Mountains, on the south end of the Oquirrh Mountains. And we saw that their migration takes them across Highway 73 and right on the outskirts of Eagle Mountain. And so we talked about Utah being the fastest growing state, and Eagle Mountain is one of the fastest growing cities within Utah.
Oh, yeah.
And so the area where these deer are migrating through is all part of the city, and could potentially in the future be buildings and houses, and
Sure.
it could be very difficult for the animals to make that migration. And so yeah, we're working with a lot of partners right now in the city of Eagle Mountain, and they're really interested in trying to preserve open space for the deer to move through that city as the city grows.
That's awesome.
So it's been really incredible to see everybody come together to try to solve the problem.
That's super cool. I love that kind of stuff. And I think just even that in itself is a huge success, to see different organizations and people and partners come together and
Right.
kind of this common goal to help wildlife. That's awesome. So what are some things that people, just individual people, could do to maybe help in these efforts for wildlife migration?
Right. So one of the things that we've done to help the public better understand these issues is we put together a website this year. It was new in March, and that you can go to it at wildlifemigration.utah.gov, And there you can see a lot of where these tracking projects are occurring. So we have maps that show that. We have videos that kind of explain some of these stories that we talked about and highlight different issues around wildlife movement. There's maps of migration corridors, so you can kind of see where these areas are at. And so I think it's a really good way to get informed and kind of understand the issue. That the website should help you quite a bit.
It is a super cool website, I must say. Yeah, it's got a lot of cool information and data. Yeah, you can like watch the little tracking for some specific animals is cool.
Right. Yeah. So if you're interested in more about that razorback sucker movements that we were talking about, you can see an animation that on the map, so you can see where that animal went. And there's different ones for deer and for the boreal toad we were talking about. So that's really cool. The other thing is that the tracking wildlife is still relatively expensive, so we could always use help with that. So some of these tracking collars cost about $1,000.
Oh, wow.
For birds, they're a lot more expensive, closer to $3,000 or $4,000 for one tracking device. And so there are ways on the website that you could donate if you feel inclined and wanted to support the effort.
Very cool. No, it is definitely really important work, as I've learned stuff, just from talking to you in the program and kind of looking at that website. There's a lot of really cool stuff that's going on. So thanks for coming on and highlighting this today and kind of helping educate some of us on wildlife migration and the importance of it and ways that we can help. So I appreciate that. As always, if you haven't yet subscribed to the Wild Podcast, we'd love if you could do that. You can find the podcast anywhere that you listen to your podcasts, on your apps and on the DWR website. And we hope that you will join us next month for some more wildlife stories.